is simply the total amount of hard sets you do per week. That's going to be the number one driver of muscle growth. The average gym goer trains some 7 to 10 reps away from failure. That is simply the number one reason that they still look the same when you get to the gym 2 years later. You see the same person, they look exactly the same.
Menno, welcome back to the show.
Pleasure.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you, and we're going to do like a overview of the latest strategies and most optimal strategies to build muscle, lose fat, and improve body composition. But I want to start with: is there anything surprising or very interesting that has been discovered recently over the last few years, maybe about body composition and muscle growth that we didn't know before?
I would say that for muscle growth, some of the most important findings have been the emphasis on length-mediated hypertrophy or stretch-mediated hypertrophy, that the long length exercises generally seem to be better than most other exercises. And this largely explains the findings of full range of motion generally being superior. So we used to say full range of motion is best and you want the extra range of motion. And we knew, or experts knew, that it's not the actual joint range of motion that matters, it's the functional excursion, it's the change in muscle length. But it seems that it's specifically going to longer muscle lengths that is important for muscle growth. So if you increase the range of motion by going to a shorter muscle length, that doesn't actually seem to be beneficial. So that explains why if you squat deeper, if you lower the bar more during a bench press, that's just generally advantageous. But it means that locking out, for example, at the top may not be necessary. So that's one trend of research that we have a lot of studies on. We're still gathering a lot more information because the initial studies seem to be extremely positive. But then as more research came out, as often there's some regression towards the mean, and we see that the effect is much smaller than believed and maybe context dependent as well.
Gotcha. So for one example of that would be like the lat pull down, right? If you go to the top, then you can really stretch it out and pull it down. So that's a longer range of motion and it would result in greater hypertrophy.
Exactly. And so it appears that that's beneficial, but it may not be so beneficial or necessary to really lower it all the way down to your chest. So if you would consistently lower it to, just below the chin, that's probably equally good. Now, I do still like lowering it to the chest for some purposes because you cannot fake it. Like the bar either touches your chest or it doesn't. And what you often see if people, they lower it kind of to below the chin, then it starts going here, and then they start moving up the head instead of pulling the bar down. And then it's a bit of a slippery slope when it comes to cheating and technique.
Yeah, and I do remember pro bodybuilders or if you look at pro bodybuilders doing a chest press, then they don't lock their elbows out at the top completely. They kind of go a few degrees off, and then the biggest stimulus comes at the bottom anyway.
Yeah, I would say that pro bodybuilders, some of them do things right intuitively, but there are also a lot that don't use full range of motion at the bottom either. So they just kind of stay in the mid-range, which is probably also not ideal.
Yeah. Anything in the diet world surprising?
Most research has come down to the conclusion of energy balance being the main determinant. Protein intake is debated again, with some research indicating higher intakes than previously believed may be beneficial. The support for that is quite weak, though. Less research, or more research, has found that carbohydrates are not as important as many people thought. I've long been skeptical of carbohydrates being necessary for strength sports, but now research has been, I wouldn't say completely conclusive, but quite strong that carbohydrates have a very small role, if any, for muscle growth and strength development.
Yeah, and that's because you utilize glycogen for this strength-based movements, but if you do, let's say 5, even 10 reps, then you're not using that much glycogen that you would need to consume carbohydrates for. Your body would replenish the glycogen even without carbs, but consuming carbs would do it a little bit faster, right?
Exactly. The glycogen stores in muscle are sufficient to cover around 2 workouts for most people. And that's assuming the workout is already quite high volume for that one muscle group. Because if you do a full body workout, you might conceivably do some 3 workouts or so before you would run out of glycogen stores. Now, there are some muscle fibers which run out a bit faster, like the type 2 fibers. But still, most people just don't get near the volumes that are required to completely deplete glycogen stores or even get to the level where contractile functioning is impaired. And then afterwards, most people have at least 24 hours in between their workouts. And you actually get very high glycogen resynthesis, even if carbohydrate intake is not very high. So We
Mm,
used to think like, oh, if the body doesn't get carbs, then it cannot resynthesize glycogen. But actually, it has quite some pathways, including the use of fat to synthesize glucose and thereby glycogen, and also the Cori cycle, by which carbohydrate is essentially, or glucose is essentially recycled when it's produced, when lactate is produced, and then it's recycled back to glucose. So there are some pathways by which the body can quite, not as efficiently as with carbohydrate, but still quite efficiently synthesize carbohydrates. And the nice thing is that all these pathways are upregulated when someone is on a low carb diet. So the body's just much more adaptive than many people think.
yeah. And what level of, I guess, strength and muscle are we talking about? Like, do professional athletes also don't need any carbs then, or at what level does it become advantageous?
It's mostly the modality of exercise, like the type of exercise you do, not so much the level. A professional bodybuilder, for example, might still not require pretty much any carbs. And there are
Mm,
some very successful bodybuilders even that have low carb diets. It's just that when you're on a low carb diet, everything is a little bit more deflated. So you look
mm,
leaner. You are literally a little bit deflated because glycogen stores, they stabilize at the lower level, something like 70-80% of baseline normally. So your muscles are a little bit less full, but you also retain less water, and that creates the look of being drier but a bit less full. And I think people associate that acute effect with the long-term change, and those are different things. So if you
right.
go into ketogenic diet right now, then you're immediately in like 2 days going to lose a substantial amount of weight, almost all water, and then your muscles will look less full, but you're going to look drier. Your six pack's going to come out better, and then people think, oh, it's great for cutting, but it's not so great for building muscle. It's just, no, that's just the acute effect, not the long term effect.
Gotcha.
But
Yeah.
as regard to your question about the type of exercise, if you're talking about a concurrent athlete or something, then the carbohydrate requirements increase dramatically. So if you give me a tennis player as an athlete, as a client, then it's a very different story from someone that just does strength training. Because as you said, the strength training is like 5 to 10 repetitions often. Then you have a rest interval. That's very different from somebody that does tennis, which is like almost continuous high intensity interval training for quite
Mm,
long periods of time for the same muscle groups with very short break activities, or soccer, which is also essentially a combination of long term, like steady state, longer cardio interspersed with short sprints. So those have far, far higher glycogen requirements for performance.
yeah. And like CrossFit is probably one of the most glycolytic sports out there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so interestingly, even CrossFit seems to be at the point where it's kind of like in the middle,
Okay.
where we see that there's still not a consistent effect on performance. So that's, I think, very strong research that, yeah, when you get to even lower levels than, or substantially lower levels than that in terms of glycolytic requirements, we don't get the need for carbs. Like powerlifters, bodybuilders, it's not even close for most people.
Right.
CrossFit is like, okay, yeah, there you would really expect it, but we still don't really see consistent effects in research.
Mm, yeah, that's interesting. Um, so yeah, maybe let's start with resistance training itself. So training component. How do you need to train to facilitate muscle growth? We can start from the main like signaling pathways, and then talk about the different rep schemes and sets, etc.
So the primary driver of muscle growth is the mechanical tension on the muscle fibers, which is essentially the same as the internal force output. So the muscle has to produce force, and when it produces a lot of force, and that's a limiting factor for the movement, the muscle essentially learns to produce more force. And one of the ways it adapts to that is by getting bigger. Because if you have higher cross-sectional area, it's like the bigger engine, you can produce more force. So the way you do that is by exposing muscle to, or using a heavy enough weight, something you cannot do 13 repetitions with, generally speaking, and then going close to failure. You get a lot of tension on the muscle fibers. And then you need to do that for enough total time under tension. And I'm not talking about like the time under tension per set, but the total amount per week, even.
Mm,
So muscle has a certain level of stimulus that it receives from every set that you do. And the distribution over time doesn't seem to be that important. It's more of a cumulative effect. So you can do a lot of volume on one day, you can spread it out across the week. But the easiest way to think about this in practice is simply the total amount of hard sets you do per week. That's going to be the number one driver of muscle growth. It's like the equivalent of your energy balance for fat loss. Like for fat loss, the number one thing you want is like your total cumulative energy deficit across the week as a whole. And then for muscle growth, the number one thing is the total amount of sets per muscle group per week.
mm. Does it have to be close to failure, or how close to failure does it need to be? Where does it characterize as like a hard set?
Mhm. Yeah, there is it's mostly linear when you get to reasonably high levels of effort. So when you're within at least 5 reps to failure, we can say that it's mostly the total repetitions that you do that are the best proxy. So if you leave, for example, 5 reps in reserve, then you're going to have to make up for those 5 reps in another set to get the same growth. And we see
Hmm.
that in research where we compare, say, 3 sets to failure versus 4 sets, not quite to failure, but with the same total number of repetitions as those 3 harder sets. And we see that you get equivalent results between those two groups. So
Hmm.
in that case, the reps seem to be kind of equally effective. But when you get to more than 5 repetitions away from failure, the reps do seem to be a little bit less effective per repetition, especially when you get below 8 reps to failure. So you're not
Hmm.
even close to failure.
Right.
Now that for most serious strength trainees, that's not a real consideration, but there is actually a recent meta-analysis that found that the average gym goer trains some 7 to 10 reps away from failure,
Okay.
and that is simply the number one reason that they still look the same when you get to the gym 2 years later. You see the same person; they look exactly the same. It's like, yeah,
Right.
doesn't matter, what kind of small optimization you're doing if you're training 10 reps away from failure.
Yeah. Yeah. So rather than stopping when it gets even slightly uncomfortable, you need to stop when you can't move any more than like a few reps, like 2, 3 reps anymore.
Yeah, a good guideline for both coaches and individuals is that you should experience slowdown in your repetitions, especially if you're
Hmm.
training for muscle hypertrophy. Like if your last rep looks the same as your first rep, then there is very little velocity loss and you're most likely not close to failure.
Mm. Yeah. And what intensities are we talking about? So like obviously 1 rep max is your 100% maximum, and 50% is 50% of that. What kind of intensities do you need to lift to what is like the bare minimum threshold, and what is like a sweet spot in your opinion? Because if you
Mm,
only do 1 rep maxes, right, then that's you need to do a lot of sets and reps for that.
exactly. Yeah, the only issue with going heavy is that you get very little time under tension per set. So if you're doing, sets below 4 repetitions, most people say about 5 to 30 is the range. So if you're not even doing 5 reps per set, then you might have to do additional sets to compensate for the very low number of reps that you're doing per set. But in principle, every rep, 1 repetition at 100% of your 1RM is better than 1 repetition at 90%. The only issue is that you can only do 1 repetition because it's your max.
Mm.
So per repetition, it's probably a little bit more effective, but per set, it's very ineffective. And then the kind of lower intensity that you have to hit, so the minimum intensity threshold, seems to be very low, much lower than believed 10 years ago. It's around 30% of 1RM or 30 repetitions. I usually go with whatever is harder, because some people at 30% of 1RM, especially women, they can do like 80 repetitions and it just becomes completely impractical. Not to mention just boring and excruciating to do the set. So like 30 repetitions or 30% of 1RM is like the minimum you need. And it seems that when you go below that, you just can't get the level of mechanical tension anymore. Like if you're doing 80% of 1RM, almost all of your muscle fibers, especially if you're training explosively, are recruited. All the motor units, they are at least recruited to some extent every repetition. And then when you get to a lower intensity, you don't recruit them from the start, but it's like the big guys come in to help when the smaller guys get tired, sort of. That's the size principle of motor unit recruitment. So technically, local neuromuscular fatigue lowers the recruitment threshold to higher threshold motor units. And then the bigger motor units with more type 2 fibers, which have more growth potential, they kick in and they start helping later on in the set. And the funny thing is that if you look at velocity and a motor unit behavior, the last, say, 5 repetitions of a set of 20 are actually very similar to if you do a 5RM. And if you look at someone's final repetition of a 20 rep max set, if they are truly going to failure, it looks very similar to the last repetition of a 5 rep max set.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. You see like these calisthenic athletes, often they do a bunch of reps and they still look pretty muscular. So like they do 100 push-ups, 100 dips or whatever like that, and because they're still within this effective range of intensity, but they do so many reps that they take it so close to failure that the signal is still there. And the polar opposite of that would be like a strength athlete. like a power lifter or a bodybuilder, that they do only like 5 reps, 6 reps, and the intensity is greater, but they do less reps, so they still reach that, I guess, the hard zone much faster in a shorter amount of time.
Yeah, it's also why you see things like people getting jacked in prison. And
Mm.
a lot of people, like bodybuilders, they learn about weight training and optimized exercise, and they're like, why are these guys still getting jacked? It doesn't make any sense. Like they're just doing push-ups. And well, push-ups are actually not that bad. You can, especially if you elevate them, if you increase the range of motion, you use full like good technique. Then especially if you cannot do 30 strict push-ups yet, which many people can't, and you just go to failure and you do enough sets, you can build a lot of size with that. And especially when you add dips and chin-ups, you can progress a long, long way with bodyweight exercises. So that's when you see these calisthenics athletes in the park and stuff. If you combine that with good genetics in particular, then yeah, you can actually get some really good physiques
Mm.
equal to if they were to go to the gym.
Yeah, but what about these isometric exercises like a front lever and this planche? They're like completely isometric during the set. And would that also then yield the same muscle hypertrophy results? Because you don't see like gymnasts who do a lot of these things, they're not like massive, although they spend a lot of time under tension during these isometric exercises.
It seems that isometrics are a little bit less effective than dynamic exercises, but it's mostly due to the length of the muscle at which the isometric contraction takes place. So an isometric contraction means that you're doing an exercise and the muscle is not changing length. You're producing just amount of force and you're static, you're in the same position. Now, if you are doing that at a short muscle length, it's not that effective. But if you're doing that at a very long muscle length, it can actually be very effective.
Gotcha. Yeah. So what I've found when I do some of these exercises is that they're very pretty good for strength. Like you get quite stronger with them, but yeah, you don't see the muscle hypertrophy as much. Or maybe I'm not doing enough time under tension with it. Like maybe I need to do like, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes in total per workout to reach some effect. But yeah, for strength, they definitely work quite a lot.
Yeah, so you need to have holds, I'm guessing at least 10 seconds and maybe to be safe, even more than that. So it's more of a
Yeah.
prolonged set. And it's also mentally for a lot of people, it can be harder to push yourself to go to failure with an isometric contraction because it's more like endurance exercise where if you're not, it's hard to explain, but psychologically, it's for some reason much harder if you don't have a target. And there's
Mm.
also some research to indicate that if you know you can do 10 repetitions and you have to push yourself to get all 10 of them, it's much easier to do that than with an isometric where it's like you can hold it for about 10 seconds, but then it's a very slippery slope. Just like, a run to exhaustion. If you
Right.
run on the treadmill for max speed or max distance for 3 minutes or something, there's much more variance there than if I tell you, do this weight, do as many reps as you can. It's going to be like 8 on average. Maybe sometimes you only get 7 on a really bad day. Maybe you get 6. Maybe on a great day you can get 9. But with endurance training and isometrics and grip strength too, it's much more dependent on your emotional level, your input, your motivation. Did you sleep well? Is someone shouting in your ear to perform maximally?
Mhm. Yeah. What about sprinting? Like that's a very common image you see online, that the sprinters are super jacked, and maybe like cyclists as well. Like they do this sprint cycling. They have massive quads.
Yeah, but it's not the actual cycling or not the cycling in the sense of being on a bicycle at least. It's the
Right.
cycling in the sense of drugs maybe that
Yeah.
gets them that physique. So most sprinters, they do a lot of strength training. So if you look
Mm.
at an Olympic level sprinter, for one, it's the ones that are doing the 100-meter sprinting or less. Those are the ones that are jacked. And they're jacked because their training does not resemble endurance training at all. They do
Mm.
like 5-10 second sprints and then they rest for long periods of time. So the rest to work ratio is very much like people in the gym, where the effort is relatively short duration and then you have a long rest period. And on top of that, they do a lot of essentially bodybuilding / strength work. So they basically just have a lot of gym work and then high protein intake and diet, and they get shredded because losing weight and fat in particular is also very effective to get faster.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the best ways to get faster is to lose fat. It's much easier to get
Right.
faster by losing weight than it is to get faster by building muscle.
Hmm.
So yeah, if you're shredded and then you're doing a lot of strength training and then you add some sprinting on top of that, and then when you look at the best sprinters in the world, you're also talking about people with great genetics, and many of them are on drugs. So yeah, then you have great physiques generally.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's not that sprinting will build you like massive quads. It's like, what they do behind the scenes is they do a lot of squats and, Bulgarian split squats and those things that build the quads and the legs, and the
Yeah,
sprint on top of that is their actual sport, but, it might contribute a little bit, right? But, not a lot.
exactly.
What about like these different types of, let's say, modalities of building muscle? So like compound lifts, machines, calisthenics. We discussed already a little bit, but is there any difference between these barbell free weights and machine exercises?
Not much. Most research that has come out has found that machines, free weights, cable, dumbbell, barbell, kettlebell, it's all equally effective. Body weight exercises too. Now, you do want something that has dynamic contractions with an eccentric and a concentric component. So that's not the case for everything. Band training, for example, is probably not that effective because the resistance curve is very poor. You basically get the most resistance in the shortened position. And depending on what type of exercise you do, it can be more concentric based. And you want that eccentric, that tension during the lowering phase or during the lengthening phase of the muscle that is producing a lot of the muscle growth. So as long as you have that, it doesn't matter if you're lifting a machine or your grandma, you get the same results if you're getting the same mechanical tension on the muscle fiber. The muscle doesn't care what
Right.
it's lifting, it just registers the tension that it's producing.
Hmm. Gotcha. Is there any difference in like the growth hormone or testosterone response? I've seen some of the research on the compound lifts favoring that.
Yeah, it does. It seems to be more related to the total work output, so the
Okay.
compoundedness of the exercise, if you will. But it doesn't seem to affect muscle growth so much. In fact, the hormonal output during a session is much more metabolic than it is anabolic.
Hmm.
So, growth hormone release, for example, has more to do with fuel substrate use than it
Mm.
is to actually grow.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a misconception about growth hormone that fasting increases growth hormone, but you're not gonna get jacked from just fasting.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and what I've actually heard a few years ago is that it's not even like the testosterone that determines the muscle growth in naturals. It's more about like the androgen receptor density, if I'm
Yeah, there's
correct.
a lot of variance between individuals in how they respond to a given dose of testosterone.
Okay.
So if you look across individuals, so people that have high testosterone versus people that have low testosterone, the relationship between testosterone and muscle mass is very weak. Funny
Mm.
enough, the relationship is actually a lot stronger between testosterone and low body fat levels, but that's a
Mm.
form of reverse causation because overweight people, they
Um,
aromatize most of their testosterone into estrogen. So,
right.
oh, there's even something called, um, was it obesity, um, hypogonadism, but basically hypogonadism secondary to obesity.
Hmm.
And that explains why generally overweight people have lower levels of testosterone. And therefore, you get that causation or
Right.
correlation that seems like causation where testosterone is correlated with low body fat levels.
Mm.
But if you look within individuals and then you increase their testosterone level, then you get very consistent effects. So even within the normal range, if you get
Hmm.
from the lower end to the upper end of the normal range, you build, it's like 1 pound of muscle approximately per 100 on the range of 300 to 1300. So that's a non-trivial difference for sure when you get to the from the very lower to the very upper end of the range.
Gotcha.
And then yeah, if you go higher with steroids and the like, then you get
Mm.
even bigger effects, of course.
Yeah. So if I were to double my testosterone with, most likely the only way possible to do that would be with anabolics, then I would build more muscle as a result of that.
Yes. Yes.
But and it doesn't even have to be like doubling. Even if I increase it by, let's say, 200 nanograms.
Yeah, so you could go from something like 300 to 600 if your lifestyle is not optimized at all. And then you go
Right.
to sleeping enough, stress management, sufficient fat intake, generally appropriate training volume. So not overtraining, but also not undertraining. When you do those things right, then it's quite possible to go from something like 300 to 600. You probably
Yeah.
won't go from 600 to 1200 though.
Yeah. 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 So mine on average is like 750 to 800. So yeah, it's gonna be hard to double that with natural
Yes.
means.
Yes.
Um, yeah. So it doesn't matter if you do compound lifts or machines or cables or anything like that. I guess the only difference would be the functional component. Like a barbell squat mimics a lot of actual, everyday activities, and a pull up is quite functional, and a deadlift is, very functional movement.
Yeah, so it's very specific to the movement. And it's functional to the extent that what you're training for mimics
Hmm.
what you want to do.
A deadlift, yeah.
So like a pull-up is functional if you want to do pull-ups or rock
Right.
climbing or something like that. But it's no more functional than a pull-down if you're doing arm wrestling, because there's very little direct crossover. It's
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah, so you don't mimic the exact movement patterns in everyday life, but you do get better at like pulling, pushing, and the squatting movement motion.
yeah, there, especially for beginners, there is some movement that a compound exercise has much better carryover in general. So there's
Hmm.
even one study which is kind of crazy where they found that doing leg presses increased leg extension strength more than doing leg extensions. Now that only
Wow.
happens in beginners because normally specificity is king. Like what the exercise you do is the exercise you get the most strong at, and there's nothing you can do to get better at a certain exercise or movement than that exact movement.
Hmm.
But in beginners, you get that improved coordination from learning how to coordinate different muscles at the same time.
Right.
That can improve strength and also increase rate coding. So it increases like the central drive to those muscle groups. Now
Mm.
that quickly tapers off because it's not that difficult to learn for the body. But when you get to that novice intermediate phase, after that it's mostly very specific movement coordination.
Gotcha. So it's like a leg press builds more leg muscles than a leg extension because it targets a lot of multiple leg muscle groups rather than just single one. So if you have just stronger legs, your leg extension will be also stronger. Whereas if you do just leg extensions, then you train that single muscle and the progress is slower because
Yeah.
you're.
So for advanced trainees, like the leg extension will build leg extension strength the most. But in beginners,
Mm,
you might get a favorable effect of the leg press as the body learns to coordinate the muscles better. And the coordination is a lot more difficult to learn. So the neural component of strength is trained better with the leg press. And it can also increase rate coding. So the total amount of um, activation from the brain to the muscle increases.
hmm Gotcha. What about training frequency? So how often should you train? How many times a week? One muscle group?
I generally recommend training a muscle group at least twice per week, but the total weekly volume is by far the number one factor. It specifically appears that training frequency becomes beneficial when you start crossing something like 6 to 10 sets per muscle group per session, which is very relevant for people doing bro splits and push-pull legs and the like, because they routinely go over that if they're doing high volume. At that point, there's even a recent meta-analysis that very strongly shows you're better off switching some of that volume or shifting some of that volume to another day. And it's simply because you could do more volume on that day. That seems to be the main reason.
Mm,
There may also be a factor that as you get more advanced, the anabolic window decreases in length. So you're just not going to build that much muscle in one session. And there's a limit to how much muscle you can build in one session. And as you get to very advanced, it's probably unlikely that in one single workout you can induce so much growth that you're going to grow the whole week. As a beginner, no problem. Advanced athlete, much more unrealistic. If you're trained twice a week, beyond that point, it seems to be mostly the increase in volume that you're getting. Because if you're doing, say, 9 sets of leg work on one day, squats, leg press, and then also split squats. Now you take the split squats, and now you're not doing them after the leg press and the squats. You're going to be much fresher. There's less neuromuscular fatigue. So you're doing them on Friday instead of on Monday with all the other leg work. Then you're going to do more repetitions, or you're going to do the same reps with more weight on the split squats. And as a result, that extra volume is what's driving the extra muscle growth.
mm. Yeah. So the amount of the high quality reps at this near maximum effort at your most amount of mechanical tension is what will build the most muscle. And if you do a very long workout, right, and you train only once a week, then you're not really, the final reps and the sets are going to be less quality than the first ones.
Yes.
So if you rest a few days in between and then you have the same muscle group, and then you've recovered a little bit, so you can do it at the near maximum mechanical tension again,
Exactly.
and repeat it, right? Yeah, there was actually one interesting study with the VO2 max as well recently, that they had people doing either twice a week low intensity cardio and 2 high intensity interval sessions, so 4 workouts per week, or they did the same amount of volume as those did who 4 times a week in 2 days. So twice as long low intensity in one day and twice as long HIIT, so like a 1 hour HIIT cardio session versus twice a week for 28 minutes. So they got the same increases in VO2 max. So you can do the same volume on 1 or 2 days as someone else who trains across the week, and you get the same effects. So you can choose which one you prefer.
Yeah, for VO2 max, there are a lot of parallels between
Mm,
how it's built and how the muscle responds in terms of stimulus, and indeed it's like total weekly volume. I know in endurance training you often talk about impulse, which is sort of the measured average training volume. It's like total training time multiplied by effort. So to get like a weighted average effort under tension, if you will, or effort under time
mm,
under effort, and that's it's very similar to strength training in that sense. And also the dose response, the frequency effects. It's like mostly total volume per week that matters. And there's a minimum intensity. Yeah, a lot of parallels between strength and endurance.
yeah. What if someone is doing concurrent training? So they train cardiovascular exercise and strength training at the same time. So does it hinder that the muscle growth adaptations if you do a lot of cardio?
It can, yes. Especially in more advanced trainees. In beginners, everything builds muscle. And if you do more exercise, you might actually build more muscle if you add some cycling to the strength training. But when you get to train lifters, especially people that already have a decent amount of strength or muscle mass, generally you see what's called a concurrent training effect or an interference effect, by which the adaptations to both, but especially those of strength training and strength development, are hindered by doing too much endurance training together with the strength training. And you can
Hmm.
mitigate this effect a lot by separating the workouts. So ideally, you want to do your cardio one day, your strength training another day. Or if you have to do them together, then it's better to do the cardio after the strength training, either ideally like a couple hours after, but otherwise directly after the workout. And the reason for that is that if you do your endurance training and then you do your strength training, then your strength training is going to suffer because of the fatigue from the endurance training.
Mm,
But endurance training is much of the stimulus for endurance is things like fatigue and substrate depletion. So if you do strength training and then afterwards you go do cardio, then it was like you were doing, some level of cardio for that hour of strength training already, and then you
mhm.
just increase the intensity. So
Yeah,
endurance training doesn't suffer as much from having done strength training before as vice versa.
yeah. Just like pre-fatiguing before the cardio,
Yeah.
the strength
And
training.
and essentially strength training is a form of cardio. It's just a relatively ineffective form because the intensity isn't that high depending on what exercise you do. If you do like squats of 20 reps, then it's actually pretty high. But then the
Mm,
rest interval is very long for endurance training standards. So
yeah.
the total amount of effective volume you do in a strength training workout isn't that high. But if you do like what I often do is full body workouts with combo sets, which means that you're doing like bench press, chin up, squat with a minute, 2 minutes rest in between, and you do relatively high repetitions, then the total cardiovascular strain is significant for that workout. So you will see this in like your average heart rate. It will be elevated quite a lot, and for pretty much the entire workout. Whereas if you do like a 3 rep max and then 5 minute rest periods, like a powerlifter, then the endurance training stimulus is trivial.
Yeah. What would be like then a good weekly plan, like a general plan for people to follow? So you want to aim at least like twice a week per muscle group for optimal muscle growth. But I guess like once a week is also fine if you do enough volume in those workouts. And how would you and the rep scheme depends on your goals, kind of like, is it more strength power based or is it hypertrophy based?
Yeah, so you mean for training primarily for hypertrophy?
Yeah, so like muscle growth, obviously you're gonna get strength as well from that, but it's less prioritized as with a pure strength training.
Yeah, so you probably want to do at least 2 different types of workouts. And for maximum growth, you will have to train, at least twice per week and probably 3+ times, simply to get the total volume in. Because most people want to be in the range of like 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week. There are benefits to going higher than that in most research, but there's also some research indicating you get worse results. So it becomes more of a balancing act between your recovery capacity and the benefits of the higher volumes, and also things like injury risk. And if you're doing, say, 20 sets per muscle group per week, that's substantial. And you're going to have a hard time trying to fit that in. Like in one workout, 20 sets for every single muscle group, it's just not going to happen. For most
Yeah.
people, 6 is already very difficult. So if you're going with 20, you'll probably need 4 workouts realistically, and those will still be long workouts. So for most people, if you're doing something more like 12, which is still very effective for many people, you can get that done reasonably well in, say, 3 workouts per week.
Mhm. Gotcha. And how many? So it's 10 to 20 sets is like per week recommended to get per muscle group. So pulling muscle, pushing muscle, and leg muscle.
Yeah, it's a good general guideline, right? Because it's the optimal training volume is highly individual.
Hmm.
If you have, say, an investment banker as a client and they barely sleep, they have super high stress, they don't consistently get their protein in, 50 years old, you probably don't want to push them to like 30 sets per week per muscle group. But then if you have 20-year-old student that has almost no stress in their lives and they're doing everything well and they're bulking, consistently getting their protein in, like low stress, sleeping 9 hours every day, then yeah, you can push up the volume a lot more probably.
Hmm. Gotcha. But I guess the smart thing to do is to do as much as you can to get the most change and not more than that. So the unnecessary volume, you might not get any, and it might become more harmful at this excessive amounts of volume. So you need to find, okay, what amount of volume and how many workouts will give me results. And if you start doing too much, then it might become negative.
Yeah, so you can kind of climb the slope from the minimum effective volume, which is very low. Like
Hmm.
4 sets per week per muscle group can very consistently, if you train hard, get pretty good gains. You can get that done in even one serious workout per week. And then as you kind of climb the volume slope, and you're getting into the more optimized gains, but with more time investment. And then as you keep going, pushing it up to 20 plus sets per week per muscle group, you get into that range where the risk reward becomes much, much poorer because every additional set that you do contributes only marginally towards muscle growth, whereas injury risk increases significantly. And it might not even be a positive effect at all because you just can't recover from it.
Yeah. One thing we didn't discuss yet is like rest intervals between sets. So, is there any difference of how long you rest?
Yes. Generally, we've conducted some research on this as well. If you rest longer, you get better gains, and it seems to be that it's because of the volume. The best study on this is by Longo et al., where they directly compared different rest intervals and volume equated, like equating for the volume that you get from the additional rest. And they found that it doesn't matter, just like with the training frequency, basically, it doesn't matter if you get the extra repetitions from additional set or from resting longer. And if you think about it, a rest interval is essentially the same consideration as training frequency. You're talking about how you're going to spread the volume over time. We just call it a rest interval when we measure it in minutes, and we call it
Hmm.
training frequency consideration where we talk about days.
Right.
But the effects is the same. Like you can spread it across the week and you get more volume done when there's more time in between the two sets that you're doing.
Hmm. Yeah. And if you do heavier weights, so heavier intensities, something like 80% of your one rep max, then you need to rest longer, like 3 minutes, 4 minutes.
Yeah, you especially if you get to you can rest a bit less when you do very high rep work because you don't need to do all the repetitions. It's if you have some fatigue still from the last set, it might actually be beneficial because
Mm,
otherwise you still need to do the first 10, 20 reps to get
gotcha.
the high threshold motor units recruited at all.
Hmm.
Um, but it's actually not entirely clear if you need to if the rest interval is that different for different intensities.
Mm,
But if you are doing 80% of 1 RM and you don't rest long and you're getting say only 3 repetitions, then for sure you need to rest longer because just because the volume is now so low that it's very beneficial to rest longer until you can do more reps.
yeah, yeah. What if you don't have limited time and you're doing like some of these supersets and drop sets and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think they're super beneficial. The problem is just that mentally, for most people, actual supersets are not doable. They're not doable in the gym, logistically, and also mentally. If you just finish a set of squats and immediately after you do bench press or chin up, you're just gassed. You can't give maximum performance. So what I like to do is called what I call combo sets. A combo set is just multiple exercises together that you do in a combo, and you do rest between the exercises, but the exercises don't overlap in which muscles they train. So you could do, in your case, like push, pull, and leg exercise. And you rest only as long as needed for your cardiovascular recovery. So you've, caught your breath, your heart rate is back to some sane level, and then you go into the chin-ups. And if you're reasonably well conditioned, the conditions that might be done in 1 minute, even after chin-ups or a compound exercise, whereas you would need maybe 5 minutes to have near full recovery afterwards. The
Mm,
nice thing about this is that you can do squat, bench press, chin up, for example. And by the time you go back to the squats, probably 5 minutes have passed. And that
yeah.
means that your recovery on the squat is really good. But in those 5 minutes, normally you would have just rested until you did your second set of squats. But
Check
now
the
you got two
phone.
more exercises in. So you basically cut your workout time into a third.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, that's a pretty good advice for if you have limited time. What I've with calisthenics is super easy, like, and you can combine like pull-ups with dips, and because you're doing a lot more reps, you're still getting like a pretty effective signal from every set that you do, and it saves a lot of time if you do like pull-ups immediately into dips, and maybe squats or something, or abs or something like that.
Yes, exactly. That would be a great combo.
Yeah. With nutrition, so nutrition, we established that carbohydrates aren't that important. What about protein and the fats?
Fats also aren't that important directly for muscle growth, but you do want to have a certain intake to support good hormonal functioning, get your fat soluble nutrients in and the like. So for most people, you want to get your fat intake no lower than 20% of energy intake. You could try setting it per body weight, but if your energy intake goes low enough, then sometimes you just have to compromise on fats. And then protein intake is very beneficial, so you don't want to compromise on that. It's clear that you get significant benefits from at least 1.6 gram per kilogram per day. And I generally recommend 1.8 for most people that are pretty serious. And then some meta-analyses find that you get benefits from maybe higher intakes, but there isn't a single direct study finding in controlled conditions that there are benefits above 1.6. So 1.8 is already quite conservative. And then when you
Mm,
get to these levels like 2.2 for bodybuilders, common recommendation in bodybuilding circles, it's very questionable if you get any
right.
return on that. So for like the average individual, the cost benefit is very questionable.
Yeah, you hear a lot of people say that just 1 gram per pound of body weight, which is 2.2 grams per kilogram, which yeah it doesn't have any like real support for that. That you actually already maximized most of the gains from just 1.6, or yeah, like I said, 1.8 maybe.
Yeah, it turns
I
out
guess.
it wasn't too far off, but indeed the original support was very it sounds like a nice round number.
Yeah. One thing that might be useful for average people is that if they eat more protein, then they're eating less of something else. So they eat less carbs and fats, and because the higher protein has higher thermic effect of food, so they burn more calories for digesting the protein. So they're creating a bigger calorie deficit by doing that. So maybe that is like a good rationale that they see more fat loss results from eating more protein.
Yeah, a little bit, but if you run the numbers in research, the effects are quite disappointing.
Mm,
Especially when if you are replacing, it depends a lot on the food choice. If you are replacing pure butter with chicken breast, yes, there's a sizable difference in thermic effect. But if you are replacing something like spinach, right, or some super high fiber food, or avocado or olives or something with a lot of mufas, or fish with omega-3s, which also have high thermic effect, coconut oil with MCTs, right? There are a lot of those foods that have a pretty high thermic effect as well. If you
mm,
replace those with chicken breast, it doesn't have much of a difference.
right. Yeah, you're in most cases not eating pure macros. You're eating different foods, that
Exactly.
mixed foods. Um, but yeah, I guess people do it as a more just to be safe than sorry. They just exceed the amount of protein, and it doesn't appear to have like any negative health effects unless you have some kidney problems. So like, I guess why not?
Yeah, it's that's why protein I generally frame it as a minimum, not as a hard number.
Mhm.
And calorie intake, I frame it more as a budget. You want to try to stay within the budget. And then fat intake too, I frame it more as like a minimum or a range. Carbohydrate intake also more of a range. Like if you don't want to dip into ketosis, then 100 gram net carbs minimum is a pretty good target. Most people don't feel great if they kind of sometimes dip into ketosis, but they don't keto adapt.
Mm,
So in that sense, there is more of a behavioral minimum that you want to get.
mm.
But by and large, it's just the total energy balance over time that's the number one determinant.
Yeah, with the carbohydrate thing, it like if you're not in ketosis and you're kind of in this periphery zone, so you're eating 100 grams of carbs, you're not in ketosis, but you're not really getting a lot of glucose as well for energy use, would then that be like a suboptimal scenario because you're in this periphery zone? You're not fully using fat for fuel, and you're not getting enough glycogen or more carbs as well for optimal performance. So would it be better than to just be like higher carb, get like 200, 250 grams of carbs and not a lot of fat, or just be like a state of ketosis?
I would generally recommend that indeed you stay out of the twilight zone.
Right.
There is indeed one study in which a cyclical ketogenic diet, Keisel et al., underperformed a Western diet for muscle growth even.
Wow.
I wouldn't expect a lot of effect directly for things like muscle growth, but in terms of well-being, cognitive functioning, many people just don't perform well if they kind of slip into the keto flu sometimes. So if you behave less well cognitively, your mood is down, that can indirectly affect your training performance, and you can get effects on those things as well, even if there aren't like huge direct physiological effects.
Mm. Is it the same with fat? Like if you go too low fat,
There's
like
not
do you
so
have
much
any?
adaptation that is acute there. Like keto adaptation is quite rapid and you feel it. It's very significant for a lot of people. It's also why a lot of people quit ketogenic dieting. They go into keto diets, they get the keto flu, and they're like, oh, this is terrible, and they give up. So they never keto adapt, and they don't know what the benefits are like. With fats, you don't really have that. In fact, I would say that low-fat diets, especially in bodybuilding circles, are a common trap. So it seems like, oh, I'm hungry, so what do? Well, what if I change some of my fats to carbs? And then it's like, oh, I'm less hungry. I can eat more food because fat is highly caloric per gram. But then what happens is over time, they actually get more hungry and they get a lot of the negative behavioral effects of low fat intakes. And you also don't feel a negative effect on your testosterone level if you go to a fat intake of even 0. But over time, it's going to substantially harm your testosterone production. And over the course of, say, months, you're probably going to feel that.
Mhm.
So I think low fat diets are kind of the reverse, where it's a trap. It seems like, oh, there are no negative effects. But then over time, you start noticing, actually, this is not so sustainable.
Right. Yeah, I think I saw from one of the studies you shared was that 40% is kind of the sweet spot of your macros as fat for
Yeah.
testosterone production. You don't see additional testosterone benefits by going, I don't know, 60, 70% fat, but the 40% is the maximum. And if you like 20%, then that's worse for testosterone than 40%.
Yeah, so if you have the calories, I think it's nice to get to 40% of your energy intake from fats. And you don't need it for carbs because you're not, say, a soccer player.
Yeah.
So then it's nice indeed. It's a marginal benefit though. It's not like your testosterone level doubles between those intakes, but
Hmm.
still a nice bonus.
Yeah. With muscle growth, so do you need to be in a calorie surplus, and how big of a surplus would you recommend? And with losing body fat, how big of a deficit is safe to not
You don't
lose too much
need to,
muscle?
yeah, you don't need to be in energy surplus to build muscle. It's a
Hmm.
common myth. If you think about it, it makes no sense at all. Like physiologically speaking, at any point in time in our bodies, the body is building and losing muscle mass. And you might right now be building muscle in your biceps, but losing a little bit of muscle mass in your quads. And it's at all different sites in your body, there is turnover taking place. And we simply talk about the total balance as if that's like one thing, but it's not. If you have open heart surgery and you get hospital food afterwards, it's not like your heart cannot recover, right? So and it is a muscle. So the body recovers. It's just, it recovers a lot better when you're in energy surplus. So you
Hmm.
can build more muscle when you're in energy surplus. It's a lot easier. Whereas in energy deficit, you have to do things very well, and the deficit cannot be too large. So one meta-analysis found that on average in the literature, muscle growth sinks to basically 0 when you get past the 500 calorie deficit per day. Now that is not like a hard rule that applies to everyone. Obviously, it's different for like a 50 kilo bikini competitor and a 300 kilogram sumo wrestler. So I usually think of it more as a percentage based off your body fat level. So if you're a very high body fat level, you can pretty much crash diet. Like obese individual, there's very little risk. As you get leaner and leaner, you have to be more and more conservative to the point that, in the normal healthy range, 20% deficit for many people is a pretty good ballpark number. But then as you get leaner, you may want to slow it down to something like even a 5% deficit for something like a contest competitor, because the risk of muscle loss is so high. There's like no more fat to lose. There's a lot of muscle mass. The body will be much more easily incentivized to burn some of the muscle instead.
Hmm.
So that's how I think about the deficit. And then the surplus, when bulking, you want to keep small. Many people overbulk. It's called dreamer bulking now, and it only works if people are on steroids, basically. So if you're a natural trainee, then there's just a very small amount of muscle mass that you can build in any given day. Even in a month, it's not much. You can calculate based on the metabolizable energy density that has to go into the body to build 1 kilo of muscle. It's not much. And then if you divide that by 30, you're indeed talking about a very, very small deficit. So just a few percent even. For most people, it's basically the minimum amount of weight gain that you can sustainably get. So, you could be in a 50% calorie or 50 calorie surplus might be ideal, but realistically, you cannot target that because you don't know at that point if you're gaining weight or not. So you
Right.
want a very low weight gain rate, and then you want to just measure your progress over time. That's very important. And if you see like I'm increasing my energy intake and immediately waist circumference increases, caliper measurements increase, and don't really see a difference in strength gains and the like, probably excessive and taper it down. And if you still see any weight gain at all and progress is good, strength gains are good, there's probably very little benefit from pushing up the surplus higher than that.
Mm. Yeah, so like the bigger the surplus, the more weight you will gain, and you will gain more muscle as well with that, but you will also gain significantly more body fat compared to a small surplus where you will gain the same amount of muscle but significantly less body fat.
Yeah, so that ratio between the additional muscle growth and the additional fat gain becomes highly unfavorable when you
Mm.
get past even 5% energy surplus. It's
Yeah.
mostly additional fat that you gain.
Yeah, so like even like 100, 200 calorie surplus is more than enough for most people, as long as
Yes.
they're, and the key is, to still progress and lift heavy. And like bulking is for most people just an excuse to eat whatever, right? But and the training actually takes like a backseater, which is the worst thing you can do at that point. Like the training should take the bigger emphasis when you have a small surplus of calories.
Yes, and probably volume should increase in energy surplus versus an energy deficit because your recovery capacity should be better. And there is
Hmm.
indeed some research that finds that people that when they go into when they've there was a study on Ramadan fasting actually where people that started Ramadan fasting they got better strength gains when they decreased their training volume by about 30% compared to before. Now,
Hmm.
Ramadan fasting obviously hinders recovery capacity, so it makes sense that you're better off being at your new optimized volume that you can
Mm.
recover from, rather than being at the excessive volume that used to be good, but now you cannot recover from productively anymore.
Mm. So if you are in a, let's say, calorie deficit, which the Ramadan fasting is a pseudo like calorie deficit during the daytime, then you actually want to do like a little less volume because your recovery is worse.
Yes, you want to keep the intensity high, but you probably want to do a little bit less volume.
That's interesting. Yeah. So yeah, if you're in a, let's say, 500 calorie deficit, rather than doing, I don't know, should you, but the frequency should stay the same. Like you do want to still do twice a week per muscle group. You
Mm.
just do less volume each set.
So I would just manipulate the total set number indeed, or
Okay.
sets per exercise per workout.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. What about eating frequency? Is there any? There was like 2 years ago by now. There was the study that showed that 100 grams of protein was still able to be absorbed and enabled the body to utilize it for the next 12 hours compared to 25 grams. So it like exceeded that. So is the myth of that you need to eat only like 4 meals of 30 grams of protein a day by now, or is it still better to eat multiple small meals per day?
If you want to absolutely maximize muscle growth, I think you might need 4 meals, but I think you'll get very close with 3 meals per day.
Mm.
And 2 meals per day is likely significantly less effective, but still absolutely viable. So you can build muscle on 2 meals a day for sure, but it's probably going to be less than if you have 3 meals a day. That's still based on
Right.
most of the studies. The 100 gram of protein study um, has to be contextualized in the sense that this was the only protein they received that day. It was after a workout, and the workout was done after an overnight fast. So the body was
Mm.
basically starving for protein, and then what's called technically the muscle full effect is delayed in that condition. So
Mm.
fasting potentiates the anabolic response to a meal. It's like a compensatory effect for the what you lost in the fasting hours.
Mhm.
And then with exercise, the what's called the muscle full effect is delayed even more. So basically, the body allows for much higher protein synthesis after a workout than when you're resting. Like if you're just resting, you're not doing anything, then the body obviously isn't going to build much muscle. But after the workout, your body's like, oh, give me the protein, give me the protein. Like we can build quite some muscle. So in those conditions, yeah, the 100 grams they were effective. But we still have a lot of other studies that are not like completely debunked now that show that
Yeah,
under
yeah.
normal circumstances, when you had a meal before and you didn't just do a workout, the effects are they taper off a lot with higher protein
Yeah.
intake.
Yeah, I guess that study just showed that your body absorbs and uses more than the 25, 30 grams. That was, yeah,
Yeah.
commonly said. Um, what about like supplements? Are there any like supplements that are very, very favorable for body composition and muscle growth?
I wouldn't say any supplement's very favorable, but creatine, just good old creatine monohydrate, is as good as it gets for many purposes. If you are a responder, you'll get some additional gains from that, and it's pretty cheap too. Easy to supplement, like 3 grams for women, 5 grams for men, is quite good. And then there's mostly support for things that you're not getting from your diet. So I see supplements very much as supplements, in that if you don't eat fish, you might benefit from omega 3s. Many people that don't get enough sun exposure, they probably benefit from vitamin D3 supplementation. Magnesium, zinc are common deficiencies. For women, iron has a lot of benefits typically. So they're more the things that you're lacking in your diet for a specific person, rather than, I have to take this every day to get good gains.
Yeah. What do you think about trimethylglycine? It's commonly advertised as like a muscle growth supplement, but I haven't seen like a lot of consistent results from evidence for that.
Yeah, me neither. And for most of these things, even if there is research, I would love to see it in protein controlled conditions. Like if your protein intake is already sufficient, do we still see a benefit after that? Because you see that with most of the amino acids and BCAAs and everything, you get those from your total optimized protein intake. So you don't need to also supplement that.
Yeah. HMB is another like common advertised muscle growth supplement. And what I think it's most effective for is for people like elderly people or like frail people and people who are under eating protein, for example, but otherwise young people who eat a lot of protein as well, they don't really see a lot of benefits from that.
Yeah, there is some positive research in favor of it, but mechanistically, I'm also skeptical in people that already get enough protein, because it is a leucine metabolite, right? If you get enough leucine, then it's possible that you don't get enough HMB, technically speaking, but we actually wrote a letter to the editors of the journals that published some of the positive research, because there are a lot of significant issues with that research, and it's industry sponsored. So I think a significant grain of salt is warranted in interpreting it.
Right. But yeah, if you're under eating protein or you're in a like starvation style calorie deficit, then you might probably see some benefits.
Right, but I would rather just recommend whey protein or something.
Yeah, just eat more protein.
Yeah,
are there any
often
other
cheaper too.
Yeah, for sure. Are there any other like supplements out there that are like making rounds or becoming popular?
Not so much. Like beta-alanine and citrulline are popular in evidence-based circles, but again, not much compelling research support for them. Creatine have received a bit of a resurgence recently for its possible positive effects on cognition. So not just your muscles, but there's also creatine in the brain. So brain functioning might improve, but it's mostly in elderly individuals and people that have basically some cognitive impairment, rather than people that are just already healthy and live like an optimized lifestyle. And yeah, there aren't a whole lot of magic pills out there.
Any fat burning supplements?
For fat burning, fat burners is kind of a misnomer. The most effective semi-fat burners are more like appetite suppressants. And funny enough, they're actually things that are semi-legal, like bronchate or nicotine. And obviously that nicotine comes with possible addiction effects and stuff. So again, not so much there compared to...
What about caffeine? Just caffeine coffee?
Yeah, and very ineffective because of the tolerance that quickly develops. And most research finds that caffeine supplementation has no positive body composition effects in the long term, because of the small effect combined with the quick tolerance development means there's just nothing there long term.
Gotcha. But will you be doing like more movements or fidgeting and walking or something like that?
A little bit, but there may also be some compensation for that afterwards. And at some point of caffeine, which most people consume, you're mostly just fighting withdrawal symptoms. So you're not actually better off than if you weren't consuming caffeine. Most people use too much, so they are just at the point where the caffeine intake fights the withdrawal symptoms constantly. And if they don't consume the caffeine, that they are worse off. Whereas if you use only a little bit of caffeine sporadically, pre-workout, sometimes for like strategic work activities, for example, then you can actually boost performance a little bit. And you can, 100 milligram per day or so can be sustainable. You can get some sustainable boost in performance. They're very small though. So again, you won't see that as like significantly increased muscle growth, for example.
Yeah. What I do notice, if I take like the pre-workout supplement that has 150, 180 milligrams of caffeine or something, then I do notice like much better workouts, because of I'm just super amped up and like alert. But I get that effect because I don't consume it that often, right? So if I take it every workout, then I will blunt that signal, and I'm not going to be that alert and focused anymore. So it defeats the purpose. So I need to use it like strategically every once in a while only.
Exactly.
So yeah, well, thanks for coming to the podcast. Where can people learn more about you and your work?
MennoHenselmans.com, or if you're on YouTube, Menno.Henselmans, or Instagram, Menno.Henselmans. These days, the action is all on social media. So you can follow me there and check out my content.
All right. Well, thanks, and I'll see you around.
See you around.
Alright, that's it for this episode. Make sure you check out my new book, The Longevity Leap, on Amazon. I'd also appreciate if you share this episode with a friend or family member. Other than that, my name is Siim. Stay tuned for the next episode. Stay empowered.